Thank you so much, Dr. Shiva, for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, Dr. Shiva, just to start off, can you talk about how a physicist such as yourself decided to move into the field of agriculture and food and end up making this your life's work?
Well, when I am and was passionate about my physics and quantum theory, and you can see behind me is an Einstein I had sculpted between my MSc and PhD, because he was my inspiration.
Right.
Even when I was leaving for Canada to do my PhD, I became aware of the destruction of the Himalayan forests. I'd grown up in these forests. I'm born in the Himalaya. And that's when I took a commitment to work for the protection of the earth and became a volunteer for CHIPCO. I mean, to be a foreign student in American university and yet come back to constantly work your activism at home was quite a challenge, but I did it. Every winter, every summer, I volunteered for CHIPCO. And even when I came back, then I worked in the Indian Institute of Science, I worked in the Indian Institute of Management on interdisciplinary work. And it was the 84 violence of Punjab and the Bhopal disaster that forced me to ask the question, Punjab is about the Green Revolution. Bhopal was about the leak of a pesticide from a pesticide plant. Why do we do agriculture like this? Why have so many thousands of people to die? It was 7,000 local people in Bhopal in that gas leak that night. And, the photographs of mountains of bodies. And 30,000 people had been killed in the violence in Punjab. I had done my MSc honors in Punjab, so I was familiar with a peaceful and prosperous Punjab. And to see it descend so quickly into next to civil war, and I experienced that because I was working for the United Nations University on a program on conflicts over natural resources. And I said, I want to look at what this conflict is about. It's not the obvious forest conflict, river conflict, land conflict, which I was doing for their book. So I decided to study the Punjab crisis. And half the time my trips were cancelled because a bomb would blow up the railway track, or the bus before us had been bombed, and I had to come back. And I wrote that book, The Violence of the Green Revolution. And partly for me, my intellectual search is not for anybody. Nobody's my master in the world. I search because it is my life. Right. I just need to know the world I live in a more truthful, in a more honest way. And when I realized how severe this situation was, how the same people who made poisons for Hitler were now selling them as chemicals, agrochemicals to save the world and feed the world, I realized the edifice of lies was so big. And the preciousness of our farmers, our soil, our biodiversity was so special that I said, I'm going to commit myself to a non-violent agriculture. I had no idea what it would look like. I called it Ahimsik Kheti. And then the rest of my journey from 84 onwards has been the search for Ahimsik Kheti, both the science of it, the practice of it. And so that's how I ended up dedicating my life. And of course, this then took me 87 to a meeting where the same poison cartel says, now we have to pretend. They didn't use that word, I'm using it. They said, now we must own the seed through patents. And the way to do it is by commercializing GMOs. There were no GMOs in 1987. They were first commercialized in 92. So they're talking about what they want to do to make more money. And they talked about making seed saving illegal, an international property rights agreement in the GATT. And that's the day I decided I would save seeds. And then Navdanya grew out of that. So I would say that when I don't jump into a new field because someone created a fashion. I've never followed fashion, not in my clothing, not in my mind. But because when I realized that the story being told and what I'm seeing, there's too big a gap. And my seeking truth forces me to jump into it. And when I find that I can't, after knowing this, just walk away, because this is not academics for me.
Mm-hmm.
I then dedicate myself to what needs to be done.
Yeah, and I mean, dedicated yourself you have over and above. And we'll get into Navdanya in a minute and go through all of the incredible work that you have done. But first, you know, we are in the midst of a pandemic, and the pandemic has brought to fore all of the inequalities in our current food system, you know, where people are at the brink of or are already facing starvation, and the current situation that they have been in has been exacerbated by the pandemic. So where have our food and agriculture systems gone wrong? And what does a just food system look like?
My search for the last 36 years now has really been asking exactly that question. Why has our food system and agriculture system gone so wrong? And as I mentioned earlier, the first place it went wrong is we turned instruments of war into instruments of growing fruit. And of course, if you bring war chemicals into agriculture, you will declare war against the land. You will declare war on the water, against the butterflies and the bees and the pollinators and the insects. That's the first, that you turned agriculture from being the most important relationship between humans and the earth through an economy of care, through an economy of regeneration, the science of regeneration, of recycling, of law of return. And you turned it into basically a dump yard for leftover war chemicals that should never have existed after the wars. And then you changed people's thinking about how nature works, about how soil works, about how plants work, about what is food. I mean, when I did my book on the Green Revolution, since this was not a field of my training, I read every book that agricultural scientists are taught. I read, what are they taught in science? Soil is an empty container. No, the soil is a living system.
Right.
And the World Food Prize laureate this year, Ratan Lal, with whom I'll be giving a talk in a few days, he has said, yes, it's a living system. And like all living systems, it has rights. And we are a civilization which recognizes that Mother Earth is our mother. Her rights come first. Our duty is to serve her. The plants are mere plant machineries for feeding the fuel is fertilizer and the plant is a machine, as if it's an automobile. No, plants are amazing systems that turn from a little seed into this self-organized complexity and can take the sunlight and through photosynthesis give us oxygen to breathe and carbohydrates to eat. I mean, look at that amazing system. No lab has been able to recreate it in its complexity. They can analyze more and more deeply, but not create the complexity of multifunctionality at the same time. The second thing that went wrong is, while on the one hand, inputs from Hitler's labs became the basis of agriculture, the colonial idea that agriculture was really raw material production also invaded agriculture. So instead of being the place you grow food, it became the place you grow commodities. And as a result of which, we're growing lots of commodities. There's no dearth of commodities. We're burning the Amazon for commodities. But 90% of the corn and soya is going for biofuel and animal feed, because a commodity doesn't care what it's used for. Food, Annam Brahman, we say, I am the creator. It cares that it goes in the right law of flow as the currency of life. And this is the reason we have hunger built into this industrial food system. It's an invasive system which invades into agriculture, and it's an extractive system because then it extracts from the soil, from the farmer. Why are suddenly, well, the first time in history, small farmers in such destitution? My mother came back after the partition, you know, she was an inspectress of schools, and then she said, No, I've done everything I needed to do. I've broken every glass ceiling for women. And now I'll be a farmer, which is the highest vocation. So I grew up on my mother's farm, and she supported us, and she was a prosperous farmer. Just doing the right thing was not a punishment when we were growing up. And now 400,000 farmers have committed suicide. As you said, even when the corona broke, 880,000, nearly a million children in India were dying annually of malnourishment and hunger. And if you look at the World Food Program figures, they're saying if we don't change the system, which is the pandemic on top of inequalities and a structural deficiency. I have done a book called Who Really Feeds the World, as well as another called Making Peace with the Earth, in which I have a very large section on hunger by design. This hunger is not because there was a drought. This hunger is not because there was war. This is a hunger in good years and in peacetime, because it's built into a greed-driven, poison-driven food system. And so that's what we have to correct. So what does a just food system look like? First, we must grow food as nourishment, not just nourishment for humans, but for all beings. Because the same dedication I gave to studying quantum theory is the dedication I have given to trying to understand how agriculture works, how plants work, how seeds work. And what I've realized is most of the work in growing food is done by other beings. And all we have to do is feed them. We give them a little food in the soil, and the soil organisms give us tremendous foods, up to 300% increase in productivity if your soils are fertile. And if they're desertified, nothing. We did an experiment on our farm. If you grow biodiversity and you allow the pollinators to get their food, they increase your production by 30%. The bees and butterflies feed us, the soil organisms feed us. And of course, our bullocks and cows feed us, not only because they're amazing in animal energy. In 92, at the Earth Summit, I worked with our environment minister for the climate treaty. And I remember he had written that 90% of India's energy was totally renewable from animals, from other sources. Only 10% was fossil fuels, and therefore we led the movement for climate justice. And we were responsible for writing that climate treaty, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And now you barely see bullocks on the farms. I preserve them at the Navdanya farm because they give you the gift of fertility and the gift of energy. And when you work with them as partners, you are not leading to emissions that destroy the climate. So we have to realize, A, food is the currency of life. B, the web of life is the food web. C, growing food with love, care, and without poisons is an ecological duty.
Yeah, and in terms of solving hunger, which is one of the issues that you talked about, a lot of companies now are advocating for using, climate smart or climate resilient technology to cut back on food waste, to cut back on food loss, to essentially feed more people and make agriculture more effective. What is your perception, or what are your thoughts on the role that technology can play in making agriculture more effective?
Well, I think one of the new things that's happened is the word technology is used without a definition. This technology for this is an appropriate way to talk. Biodiversity for pest control, I accept that as a description of a technology. Or poisons to kill all insects. And then I would extrapolate as a scientist and create new pests. So the word technology is an irresponsible use of language. We should be using a description of what tool, because technology merely means tool. So describe the tool, describe its impact. And then, of course, people have made choices. The two things I want to mention in terms of your question is, the word climate smart first came up in the climate treaty,
Mm-hmm.
where our dear Monsanto, I've had a long association with them.
Yes.
They wanted to sell Roundup as a climate smart agriculture. And agency after agency adopted this language. Climate smart agriculture, spray Roundup. How can it be climate smart when it's killing the very mechanisms of absorbing carbon dioxide and reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, which is what the plant is? So killing a plant cannot be climate smart.
Mm.
It is climate irresponsible. Second, in Navdanya, we have saved tremendous richness of seeds, not because we calculated what is useful and what is not, because I work with the ethics that nature knows what she's doing and our ancestors knew what they are doing. So if they had these seeds, they had a use, and I will protect them. And then among these seeds, we had saved were salt-tolerant seeds. These are true climate resilience, evolved by women, evolved by farmers. 200,000 rice varieties, of which in our seed bank in Orissa, we have probably about 30 that are climate resilient, flood tolerant, salt tolerant, because the cyclones come from the Bay of Bengal. And when your farming is diverse, you will have climate resilience. So this, hammering the world with the word technology is the new fundamentalism, is the new lack of thinking. And I want to share with you a lovely, lovely quote by Buckminster Fuller. In its complexities of design integrity, the universe is technology. The technology evolved by man is thus very immature-ish compared to the elegance of non-humanly contrived regeneration. Man does not spontaneously recognize technology other than his own, so he speaks of the rest as if something something he ignorantly calls nature. Now, this is the false nature culture, nature technology divide that is the ecological apartheid that is at the root of the violence against the earth. And here is one of our topicologists saying nature is technology because she uses amazing systems. And this arrogance that the poison cartel has technology and the amazing breeding by farmers over centuries giving us salt tolerance as not breeding, that is colonialism. That is colonialism in today's age.
Yeah, and you have been throughout your career a fierce critic of globalization, and you've often drawn the links between all of these different aspects and how they feed into one another, and how essentially corporations are also following this modern day colonialism. And another thing that has come out of this pandemic, right, is that everyone is suddenly consuming local, or they are focusing on local and buying local produce, and sort of led to a little bit of a de-globalization at the moment, at least. But do you think that once the pandemic has sort of, we're sort of on the other end, or it's gone down, or it's managed a little bit, do you think there will be a re-globalization, or do you think COVID-19 will reverse or suspend globalization, at least for the foreseeable future?
Well, the first thing is, yes, there's a deglobalization. And in certain areas, it will be permanent because there is a design at work to get rid of the sectors that are no more useful for extractivism of the levels that the billionaires are seeing. But exactly at that same time, there is a hyper-globalization taking place. A hyper-globalization linked to the fact that instead of children going to school and learning, even in a mud hut on a little slate, but with a comprehensive education, they're all learning from the same Baijus, That uniformity deep into the minds of a young child while it's being formed is the new digital globalization. And I have worked on globalization first when I found out about how they wanted to use the GATT and WTO to own and patent the seed. That's how I got into it. But then I got involved with the founding of the International Forum on Globalization. And I just heard, sadly, our colleague and founder is in hospital with prostate cancer, and I hope he recovers. But the International Forum on Globalization basically brought together the best minds of the world who were questioning this. And we said, if we don't tell our stories from Malaysia, from South Africa, from Brazil, from Canada, from India, then the only story will be all the boats rose. When the tide rises, all the boats rise, you know, and absolutely trivial statements of that kind. I predicted that farmers of India will die, and we have seen the 400,000 farmers die. I've written about 5 reports, the death knell for farmers, yoked to death, that this is what this package will mean. There is now, you know, the huge amounts were put into making people fly around on cheap flights. That, I think, is over forever.
Mm.
It's not that flights have stopped. The billionaires can still fly around. Their private jets were allowed the day of lockdown, no problem for them.
Yeah.
But it'll become a very privileged freedom. Yeah.
Yeah.
Digitalization of the world is hyperglobalization, both because it is really one web, but it's just 5 rock barons. Yeah.
Mm.
How did they become so rich? Because of globalization. You know, I have studied each of them. If there hadn't been deregulation of commerce, you couldn't have had a Jeff Bezos.
Mm.
If you hadn't have patents on software and no taxes on the movement of software, Microsoft wouldn't have become as big, or Gates wouldn't have become as rich.
Mm.
So all of this was part of deregulation. Globalization is nothing other than deregulated commerce. Yeah, because all honest commerce is regulated by people engaged through being honest. Yeah, in true communities, people don't cheat each other. You know, I just love our vegetable vendors in India. You know, they don't try and cheat their customers because they know they have to come down the same street every day. They'll even lend money to their buyers in India. You know, I think the only country where you can borrow from the person you have to pay, and they trust you. Deregulated commerce is not just deregulated, that laws are knocked down. And what are these laws? Each of these laws was put in place in order to protect the environment and people. Because we had deregulated commerce as colonialism. The first free trade agreement is not WTO. The first free trade agreement is East India Company. 1716, called Farrukhsheer Farman and the Right Honorable East India Company. This was a method of stealing. It still is a method of stealing. And the billionaires are a result of deregulation, and the 5 tech billionaires have now designed the future they want, which is on certain elements hyper-globalized, and certain elements leaving you to yourself to fend for yourself, which is why we need new solidarity, we need new economies. And my work on local economies of agriculture is giving people who, I mean, we've just had new laws on food and agriculture, but these were laws put in place, or drafts put in place in 91, when neoliberalism started, World Bank structural adjustment. They've been trying for 30 years. For 30 years they were trying, but they couldn't get it through. But they could during the lockdown. Yeah. So these laws are going to create a huge crisis. And this is hyperglobalization, because in effect, it's opened the doors for anyone to trade as they want to, with no guarantee of prices, with no obligations for mandis. I mean, you know, because I work with farmers, the mandis have already started to close, which means the exploitation of the farmers will increase. I've written about this. And so globalization, you know, is really return of colonialism. It is recolonization. And in recolonization, we had the impoverishment of our people. We had the extraction. We had the transfer of $45 trillion annually. No, 45 trillion during the British rule, leaving 60 million hungry. We could, if we don't prepare, be back to days of famine. And this is why the food issue is so central.
And is there a version of trade and commerce that you can elaborate upon that fits well with the principles of earth democracy and seed satyagraha and the values that Navdanya has?
Oh, yes, very much. I mean, that's what we practice. So let me distinguish between three in phenomena, right? I would call the philosophy of a democracy derived from the philosophy of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the earth as one family. This is the idea of planetary citizenship, that we are one humanity on one planet. And all deep values, all deep religions, all deep civilizations like ours have stood their ground because they were organized around this. And their commerce was organized around this. The second is trade. And India was an international trader before globalization. We led the world trade. We were 25% of the world economy because of our textiles and our spices. Our spices is what made Columbus set sail and he landed in America, and all indigenous people of America have been called Indians because he didn't realize he wasn't in India. Yeah? But of course they looted the Americas and destroyed the cultures and pushed people to extinction. Vasco da Gama came for the same. He landed in the right place. And then the East India Company, its name tells you it was created for India. 300 merchant adventurers of England, 1600. They wanted our wealth and they took it. What was happening between all of history, thousands of years of history, till the year 1600? Did we not trade? No, the world came to us. You know, our national anthem has 5 stanzas, which are not sung. But the third or fourth says, people, you know, Tagore writes, people came from around the world and made this their home. Religions came from around the world and made this their home. Christianity and Islam is older in India than it is in Europe and the Middle East, you know, because the trade was linking the best minds to the best people, yeah, and people were making free choices, not through wars, but through trade. International trade was destroyed by the East India Company globalization. The model we promote is, first, you must protect the earth and the ecosystem. That trade between humans and the earth is the first trade, because transaction is taking place. Yeah, materials are flowing. The second is your family and your community, therefore local economies. Third is regionally, the most important things you must produce for yourself. And the most beautiful thing I've realized is, when you produce for yourself, you produce beauty and quality, which is why our handicrafts were so lovely. When you produce for someone else, the quality starts to go. But when you produce quality, your quality will travel. So India's textiles went to the world. India's foods are everywhere. The samosa, I've had a reception with Prince Philip serving me a samosa, you know. Indian cuisine is under such attack right now under the new globalization. It is quite amazing. And when you ask me, is it deglobalization? The period, the last 30 years of globalization, we might be seeing an end to. But Bill Gates has 14 patents with him and Silicon Valley on an impossible burger, a fake food burger. They're really thinking, why should we have farmers? Why should we have food? Everything should come from a lab. Why should we have humans? We should upgrade the human into machine, you know? And, you know, their dystopia, sadly, because of their financial power, they're turning it into the human future. And I love being human. I just love the earth too much to just hand over and say, okay, I will merge into your machine and just be a user. And you can judge me and my value through your algorithms. I have not accepted any slavery. I will not accept digital slavery.
Yeah. I think that's really powerful as well, because a lot of, I think it was just a couple of days ago, I was watching on the news channel that this scientist, he was a professor at some university in the UK, he was just saying how they want to upgrade to humanoids and essentially like plug in human thoughts and patterns and monitor them through technology. So, I mean, what you're saying is definitely not something that seems like far off. It's already being worked on at the moment.
In fact, I have just 3 days ago released a book with a very famous Ayurvedic physician, exactly on these new technologies, and 3 patent applications. Which I said, oh my goodness, these 3 patent applications, they need a response from a civilizational ground. So I've analyzed it from my scientific basis, an ecological basis, the 2 futures of food, health, and humanity. How do we look at food in the Indian system? How do we look at health? You know, yoga and Ayurveda didn't come out of nothing. They're very hugely sophisticated analyzed systems. And then what does being human mean in today's time? When there are those who basically have reduced us to patent number 060606 as users of machines, you know? That we are appendages to their machines. And there couldn't be a higher devaluation of humanity. And this to me is the particular irony of it. Because of the climate crisis, because of the extinction crisis, because of the food and health crisis, just now was the peaking of awareness that we are part of the earth. We can't keep abusing her. We've got to make peace with the earth. We can't push species to extinction. And there is this huge wave of awareness that our humanity is rooted in being of the earth, recognizing we're part of nature. And just at that time, there is this assault, thoughtless assault, thinking that people don't think, basically saying, no, we are separate from nature. And this, I mean, I even have it in here. You know, Google has patents on putting nanoparticles to deal with anemia when all you need to do is have turmeric, which is 67 micrograms in 100 grams, or Parapu Kirai 14, Moringa leaves 28. You know, we used to eat amchur all the time. I don't see it too much now, but mango powder 45. Our diets were rich. The disappearance of the diversity of the diet has led to anemia. Well, grow more diversity, create gardens everywhere, rather than put untested nanoparticles. And the House of Lords in British Parliament had said, these should not be allowed because they have not been tested. More seriously, scientists have said the type of hazards this will create, we don't even have a science to look at it, because a nanoparticle is 10 to the minus 9. You don't even know how to investigate its movement through crossing all your membranes and therefore destroying, just like climate crisis is destroying the planetary boundaries, the health crisis is destroying the membrane boundaries, which are protectors. And now you're creating nanoparticles which will have no respect for any protection. So it needs a deep, deep reflection. And in this particular case, you know what the chief of the New Life Sciences Division, Andy Conrad, has said? We have to defeat Mother Nature. So here's a 500-year-old failed, violent, colonial, Cartesian enterprise of the mechanical mind saying, now our final victory. And here's the world waking up and saying, no, we'll return home.
Yeah. And I want to turn our attention to the contributions that you have made towards ecofeminism. And in your book, Ecofeminism, you draw a parallel between patriarchal oppression and the destruction of nature in the name of profit and progress. Can you explain how these two things are interconnected and what makes women particularly vulnerable to this twin threat?
85, I gave a talk on women and environment at the World Women's Summit in Nairobi.
Mm-hmm.
And my publisher, at that time, Kali for Women, now Women Unlimited, she came up to me and said, you got to write this because no one makes this connection. And I said, I've just left academics and I'm not going to write. I've given up writing. I'm going to be an activist. And she said, well, no, writing can be part of activism. And I wrote Staying Alive at that time because of her thing. And I had by then already been engaged nearly a decade of ecological work. And the two things that kept coming to my mind was, here are the women who know the forest, the women of Chipko, but here's a scientific forestry that only extracts. Here are women who know the land and the farming, and here are agricultural experts who only know how to extract. So I had to go to the roots of the system of science, because I'd studied a science of quantum theory, minds like Einstein and Schrodinger guiding that field. And that's when I did the research to find out where did this thinking of humans as separate from nature and the need to dominate women and nature come from. And I want to just share this with you. So in 1600, I talked about the East India Company being created. Well, around that time, the Chancellor was Francis Bacon, who was defining a new science. He called it the masculine birth of time. And he talked about the nature of things betrays itself under torture, not directly. And why was this so important? Because witch hunting and torture was what he was looking after. And he based science on torture. The interrogation of witches as a symbol of the interrogation of nature, the courtroom as a model of inquisition, torture through mechanical devices as a tool for the subjugation of disorder were fundamental to the new scientific method. And he called it masculine. He has talked about how we have to torture nature and subjugate her. And he's already put down women's knowledge. So why are women particularly vulnerable? Just think of the fact that it was women who were burnt as witches. And even today, women's violence against women is a very big reason for femicide. Very high levels of women are killed for only one problem, that they act as subjects and as thinking subjects. And that's a crime in a capitalist patriarchal order. But at the same time, we know by a Bacon defining nature as dead or women as not having knowledge doesn't take away our creativity, and it doesn't take away nature's creativity. And we are really, I think the 21st century will be a defining century for the creative forces of nature and women to speak in their beautiful, non-violent ways that the violent mind does not understand and cannot hear. But this is what will shape the future, because, in my short life, I've seen the Green Revolution destroy everything in 20 years. I've seen the GMOs rise and fall in 20 years. I have seen miracle after miracle being imposed and collapse. And this transhumanism that the digital emperors imagine, it can't last. as it is, the highest number of young people who go to mental disorders are those who are living in their technology paradigm. Because they don't have the interactions that make us fully human. They don't have the nourishing of the mind and the emotions that allow us to have emotional intelligence and compassionate intelligence and all of the intelligences that make us alive and secure and comfortable within ourselves. So I believe the non-violent creative force of women and nature, Prakriti, nature, Shakti, women. This will be the defining force. And no matter how powerful some capitalist patriarch thinks they are, and no matter how violently they impose their agendas, nature cannot be crushed, and women's spirit has been uncrushable.
That's such a wonderful thought, and that's such a wonderfully affirming thing to look forward to as well. And
it won't just happen, you have to be part of it.
Yes, exactly. And that's why it's so inspiring to speak to you, because you have been a part of it. And I think it's definitely very encouraging for young women and younger women who are younger than me, to actually hear and learn from your journey. And what role do you think that men can play in this? Because, I was just going through this study that says that even when it comes to making simple swaps, for using a reusable bag or recycling, a lot of men consider this to be effeminate, because they think it's being green or being sustainable or caring about the planet is an inherently feminine thing to do. So what do you think, how can men sort of be part of this movement, and what role can they play in actually being a force for good and moving away from these toxic perceptions of masculinity?
So masculinity in violent form, and as central to the male identity, and therefore shedding care as part of your identity, means shedding your humanity, because caring is being human. It is very much part of the same construction that defined women as the second sex, as having no minds and no brains, just little reproductive machines that can be owned and controlled. And while different cultures have had their own kind of patriarchies, all patriarchies were very, very narrowly defined. There were particular spheres where they said women can't do this.
Right.
But capitalist patriarchy is very universalizing. There's not a sphere in which it doesn't redefine humans into women as part of nature, unable to participate in the creative things, and men as necessarily part of the masculinist culture of domination and violence, and therefore having to shed caring, relationships as a quality. So for me, ecofeminism is about the liberation of nature, of women and men. It's not about women alone. And I'm so happy that, when I wrote this book, a lot of young women started to become ecofeminists. And then, as happens in these situations, then there was a backlash, because it was, the fact that you can recognize nature as power and women as power, oh my God, how dangerous can that be? So all my, the young women lost their university jobs, etc. But more recently, when I have been at universities to celebrate women's studies 50 years or something, ecofeminism is back because of the ecological crisis. Earlier it came because of feminism. Now it is making a resurgence because of the ecological crisis, and 80 to 90% of the people in the classroom are men. And I'll give you a tiny little story. So my book, one of my books was being released in Italian. And after my talk, book signing, there was this 7-year-old boy and spoke in Italian. The mother translated. Saying, please sign my book. I'm an eco-feminist. Now, when a 7-year-old Italian man can shed his machismo. You know, things are changing.
Yeah.
And I believe, you see, I don't think men put themselves in this position. I think the dominant structures put men and women into these positions. And men are liberated when they can participate in caring. And the future economies will have to be economies of caring. The future learnings and intelligence will have to be intelligences of compassion. And you know, the mind is a clever thing. It can shut out a huge amount of reality. And I think what I refuse to do in my life is shut down reality that I can see. And be told by some powerful man, no, that doesn't exist. So no, if I can see it, I can touch it, I can feel it, I can smell it, it exists. And I will not be Cartesian, and I will not be fooled. So I think people have shut out so much of the possibilities that I mentioned that if we'll have a human future, it'll be because women will show the way. And of course, there will be a future because nature will not be wiped out by some trivial dystopias. But more importantly, the human future will be more humanizing for women and for men by becoming far more caring and aware of their role as part of Earth citizens, as part of Earth community.
And continuing then with the fact that you mentioned that there is an increase in awareness around the ecological crisis, there are a lot more people who are participating and being more active citizens and caring about this. There's also this resurgence in greenwashing, where a lot of companies and corporations pretend, or publicize themselves or their values, their products as green or environmentally friendly, and whereas in actual fact they may not be. And I think, of course, the earliest example of greenwashing would be when Monsanto, Dow, DuPont, etc., launched the Council for Biotechnology Information in April 2000. And to gain public approval for genetically engineered foods, they sort of came up with the slogan, "Good ideas are growing." So how does one identify greenwashing? When a company says that they are so and so and they're doing whatever for the environment, how do you, as a person, as a consumer, as an activist, recognize that, what, I think I'm being lied to?
Well, greenwashing literally was physically done when I did the study on mining in Doon Valley for the Ministry of Environment in 1982, because limestone mining left the mountains white. And the miners went up and painted them green when the parliamentary committee was coming and said, "See, the mountains are green." And I said, "Yesterday they weren't, honorable parliamentarian, they've been painted." And when they brought the telescope out, they could see the green paint. Monsanto tried in 98 a greenwashing on how the world would starve without their GMOs. And in a way, it allowed us to really globalize the awareness on GMOs. We stopped them then globally. How do you differentiate greenwashing from being, living, thinking green, which is being ecological, having an ecological mind, through that ecological mind, understanding limits, through limits, undertaking the right action, and undertaking the right action knowing that exploiting the earth less does not mean a worse life. It can mean a better living. And all of these artificial constructs that have been imposed on us, you can only understand they're artificial by living the truth. So you can, have all the consultancies of the world to analyze, and there's so much fake business going on. Social media is full of fakeness, and then they have fact checks and fact checks and fact checks, and Zuckerberg keeps getting caught all the time. How his fact check team is actually part of his social washing. So you can't text-wise ever distinguish.
Mm.
If you leave it to the words, not enough. And that is why ecological commitment now must be everyone's everyday life. This is the reason I wrote Earth Democracy. I try, and I'm addressing my American friends who are so nervous for the election.
Mm.
I said, but representative democracy is a very small part of democracy. Participatory democracy is the deeper part, like the iceberg. The top shows a tiny bit. The deep part is underwater.
Mm.
That deep part is your participation, making your choices of food. And if the system doesn't allow it, making your local food systems, making your choices in what you wear, making your choices in whether I drink from a throwaway glass bottle, which is one of the plastic bottle, one of the biggest pollutant, or you just carry a little flask. You know, it's an elegant little container, much better than a plastic bottle. And one of the things I have realized in my own lifetime is when you know the relationships, when you know the ecological footprint, things that have a heavy ecological footprint, the lie screams in your face.
Mm.
And therefore, living ecologically is the best way to identify greenwashing.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to the pandemic, what has the pandemic, what should our takeaway be from this pandemic, from this year that has, brought to fore all of these different issues and inequalities, and what should we as people learn from this going forward?
Well, when the pandemic was just spreading and the flights were stopping and I had to rush back home to get home, I wrote an essay. It's called One Health, One Planet, Ecological Reflections on the Coronavirus. And what I wrote then is what I'm still thinking today. First, that this pandemic is a creation of greed. It's a creation of globalization of agribusiness, invading into forests and destroying the habitat of other species and other cultures. All pandemics of recent times have come from the forests because you took away the home of other species. The second is the pandemic's impact, because my quantum thesis was on non-locality and non-separability in quantum theory. But in quantum theory, everything is potential. Now, the microbe isn't one little bombarding missile that comes and knocks you out. It doesn't work that way in living system. It's a little virus, and we are trillions of viruses in our body. We are viromes and biomes walking. The humans are insignificant part of being human. We are a complex ecosystem of viromes and biomes. Our gut is 100 trillion, 100 trillion microbes. We are just 10%. This should bring us humility. But when we mess up the gut with bad food of globalization, then the risks of being hit by the pandemic increase. When we create more inequality because of the way the pandemic gets handled, we create the risks of hunger and more death. So it is, the takeaway from the pandemic should be, let's stop violating boundaries. Let us respect that all beings on this planet have their rights, that the earth is a living earth and she has her rights. And let us stop thinking that greed is superior. Greed is crude, it's crude. And even though the greedy have rewarded themselves, and now they are the emperors of the world, I think we need a cultural shift to recognize that the true well-being is a caring and sharing of the earth's resources. You can't be ecological unless you give back. You can't be ecological unless you stop taking more than your share. You can't be ecological unless you give to others. And all of this together then is compelling us. The pandemic has compelled us to be Earth citizens. Yeah? in periods without crisis, we can keep fooling ourselves. Here we are told, we are on Earth, one planet. We abuse the planet, we will be sick. We abuse our body, we'll be sicker. We abuse social justice, we will leave some with a heavy burden. All of these questions that humanity should be addressing all the time anyway, because it's part of being alive and being human, have become very stark in our times. And we need to address them not through propaganda, but through our own learning and our own consciousness.
And my final question to you, Dr. Shiva, for today is a little bit perhaps personal one, where, you know, your work and your, you know, throughout your work and throughout your career, people have sought to discredit you. They have called you a conspiracy theorist for creating awareness about issues that are now entering environmental movements, discourses, politics. And, you know, whether it is the value of agroecology, ecofeminism, earth democracy, it's all finally understood. It's being seen as a crucial part for building regenerative systems. How does this make you feel?
Well, I feel the same way today as I did when I realized that GMOs will have impact, that the Green Revolution had impact. I sought my truth, I spoke my truth. And no, Monsanto did not use the word conspiracy theory. That's a very pandemic language. You know, the public relations system now uses conspiracy theories. We were attacked for being anti-science. And they were so desperate to prove that we were anti-science, they removed my physics degrees from my Wikipedia pages. And even though my son would correct it, we realized they pay people to keep telling that lie. Every scientist who worked on GMOs, Eric Seralini, Arpad Putsa, all of Wikipedia pages changed. And we lived through it. And I'm very happy for the people who are becoming aware that we live in a beautiful world. We live in a biodiverse world. We don't have to use poisons for farming, that we can have other economies. I feel joyful for them, but my personal feeling about myself, when I'm hit with a stone, I feel the same way. When I'm giving an award, I feel the same way. Otherwise, I would have been ruined by now between too many ups and too many downs.
Thank you so much for finding time for this, Dr. Shiva. You are a source of inspiration to me, and I'm sure like millions and millions of people. I really, really appreciate you finding time for this. Thank you.
And I would just like to mention, through your podcast, you can announce that because of the pandemic and the lockdown, I am going to put a lot more energy in making sure everyone has access to good food that has been grown with love and with care. So people should write in through you to Navdanya and let us create an India that's poison-free. Let's create a world that's poison-free. Let's create a world where farmers don't commit suicide and no child is dying of hunger. It's doable. I've done it for 30 years. If we all join hands, we can have a beautiful future.
Yes, and I will make sure to add the details of your work and Navdanya in the podcast description as well, so that everybody listening in can connect with you, your work, and find ways to support you. And I think that will be absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much, Dr. Shiva, once again. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Marks the end of this week's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. You can find all the relevant links and handles to know more about our guest this week in the episode description. If you have any feedback, suggestions, requests, or simply just want to get in touch with us, then please do head over to our podcast website. We are available to flag and say hi to via Facebook, Instagram, or email. Thank you and see you next week.